overdoses, etc. Next. And here in a summarized form, you can see the bar putting in fifth place alcohol as a risk factor for all conditions, for all burden of disease in the world. And to the right of the bar are the very colorful number of conditions related to number of conditions that are related to alcohol, and these are all the negative effects. And you can see a tiny little bar green on the left that is all the beneficial effects of alcohol, potential in ischemic heart disease, diabetes. So overwhelmingly, alcohol causes harm everywhere in the world. And what we consider today, and experts consider in the latest analysis published in the Lancet, conclude that there is no level of alcohol consumption that is healthy for anyone. Next. So now to the data. Briefly, in the Americas, the average per capita consumption in the year 2016 was 8 liters per capita. And you can see the values then for all the countries in the Caribbean. There are about half of them that are above the average, and the rest below. The next is the heavy episodic drinking in the population, defined as 5 or more drinks on a single occasion at least once a month. And we have in males 35.9%, almost 36% of males in the total population drink in that pattern. And for females we have 9% almost. And then country by country, you can see these proportions according to sex. Great variation, particularly between men and women, and a very fairly heavy and high prevalence of heavy episodic drinking. Next. And then you can look at young people, the same indicator, heavy episodic drinking, and reminding that alcohol should not be used by young people because of the risks not only of developing dependence but also acute harms and impairments in brain development. But you can see here already males 15 to 19 years of age, 30.1% in the region are drinking that fashion, and women 6.4%. And again, you have several countries in the Caribbean that have young people drinking above the average of the whole region, which is very concerning. Next. And another indicator that you use widely is the prevalence of alcohol use disorders in the population. These include alcohol dependence and harmful use of alcohol as a diagnostic criteria, not the broad concept used elsewhere. And you see that for males, we have overall in the region 11.5%, but you have Belize above that average, and among females 5.1%, and you have overall, less of that prevalence, but 5.1% in the region is the highest prevalence in the world compared to all the regions of WHO. Next. Here is another data that we analyzed from the Global School Health Surveys done in the region only of the Americas, and in which we collected data on exposure to alcohol advertising, and about 20% of students are highly exposed, daily or almost daily, to alcohol advertisement, and that was associated with a 2 to 3 times increased risk of being an alcohol user, so meaning that the young people has started to drink already, and also having episodes of heavy drinking. Next. And there was another question that several countries included, which was how you obtain your alcohol. And most kids, these are 13 to 15 years old, get their alcohol from friends and family. And the third option from buying in a shop. But it was those who are able to buy in a shop that have the highest risk of being a heavy episodic drinking. So it was almost a 3 times higher risk of drinking heavily if you were able to buy alcohol from a shop, despite the laws that prevent that in nearly every country. Next. Another reminder that alcohol here, it harms not only the drinker, but also others that may not even be drinking. And this is a great cost to society, both health costs and social costs. There's loss in productivity, missing school, dropout of school, and poverty, worsening poverty, for example, because alcohol is being used and used in excess and takes away money that could be used for other purposes. And finally here is not much talked about, but is increasingly seen as a public health problem, is the fact that alcohol during pregnancy, in any time during the pregnancy, is the leading cause of mental retardation that is not genetic, or developmental delays in a broader context. And this should be a preventable problem if it were detected, as well if women were asked and advised not to drink during pregnancy. There are many disabilities associated with alcohol during pregnancy that are irreversible and for a lifetime. So the risk already starts in early, since the kid is born. Next. Here, from a study that relatively old, but has been confirmed in recent studies done in Canada, that the disabilities in those affected by fetal alcohol spectrum disorders, a broad range of conditions, relate to trouble with independent living, with employment, in school, with the law, with mental health issues, confinement in prison, a high prevalence of those people in prison or institutionalized, and adults that then abuse alcohol and drugs but were never diagnosed as being impaired by alcohol during pregnancy, and other legal problems with sexual behaviors. And here is the first analysis done for countries in Latin America and Caribbean, first of the estimated prevalence of any alcohol use during pregnancy in general population. So these are not studies or estimates from prenatal care clinics, but from the general population. That's how you should assess this. So we have that in the whole region, a percentage of 10% that report any drinking, and you have country by country, and you see, for example, 23% report estimated in Grenada and Guyana, very high, most countries relatively high figures of any alcohol use during pregnancy. The next then shows binge drinking, or that heavy episodic drinking, at least once during pregnancy that behavior had occurred. And you see here 6.7% reporting Dominica. What else we have here? St. Kitts and Nevis, 3.3%. These look low, but they are above the average for the region of the Americas, and that leads to the estimates of what would be the prevalence of fetal alcohol syndrome, which is the total complete syndrome in the most severe form, and fetal alcohol effects, which is the broad range of conditions related to exposure to alcohol during pregnancy. Next. And here you can see in the dark bars, you have fetal alcohol syndrome. These are estimated prevalences, and for fetal alcohol uses of fetal alcohol spectrum disorders, the total spectrum, the tall bar. And you can see that countries in the Caribbean come up as the highest prevalences in the region of the Americas. Now, this is compounded by the fact that no diagnosis is made, and undiagnosed, these kids may be the dropout, maybe some may be coming from families that the mother is an alcoholic and does not seek treatment, did not know about alcohol during pregnancy, or could not quit or have any help during pregnancy to reduce her drinking. And because there are no diagnoses, these kids can have indeed problems with hyperactivity, compulsive behavior. They tend to drop out or do bad in school, and then they start early to use alcohol and drugs. So what we think is starting with peer pressure during adolescence may be an undiagnosed problem from birth. Next. So in summary, alcohol has an impact throughout the life course, and this impact intertwined with the other risk factors that we know occur more in adolescent or during adolescence, and this increases the risk of alcohol-related harm. The exposure to the fetus, unidentified, can be a source of early problems, delays in development, and increase the likelihood of future alcohol and drug use. But also victimization. These kids sometimes are bullied. They are not seen, they're just seen as bad kids or badly behaved kids, and not that they could have a problem. It was not their fault. Family problems related to alcohol, and the lack of family supervision and rule setting create yet another environment of social acceptance of intoxication and early initiation of alcohol use. This is also often mentioned in relation to alcohol among adolescents. We also seen there is a lot of evidence, and our data confirm that the youth exposure to advertising early on and the alcohol promotions that we see in sports events, cultural events, significantly increase the risk of alcohol experimentation and heavy use among adolescents. And now take the broader picture of adolescents representing a transition from dependence to relative independence in life, is a highly vulnerable time for these stressors that can be biological or genetically induced and environmental. And these will combine with the exposure to alcohol to cause harm. Changes in the brain help drive us towards peers and away from relatives, but these earlier influences have a significant influence as well. So we cannot pick and choose one risk. And short-term alcohol use disrupts the brain function in everyone in ways that can cause memory impairments, poor decision-making, risk-taking, injuries, and death. We are not talking about problems that will start in years to come, but there can be immediate problems, and in adolescence is with relatively small amounts of alcohol. And obviously, the long-term use and continuation of use of alcohol may alter this trajectory of adolescent brain development and cause as well deficits that we don't know if they can recover. Next. So what is the solution in terms of policy? There is no silver bullet. There is a need for a comprehensive framework of policies to reduce alcohol-related harm among the general population and among youth. Next. I want to mention to you a new package of interventions which are actually based on years of a WHO global strategy on alcohol, and more recently on what's known as the best buys for NCDs. This package reaffirms the importance of working on these best buys and includes two more very good buys in terms of public health. So we are talking about restrictions on alcohol availability, on taxation, on banning alcohol advertising, sponsorship and promotions, but also enforced drink driving countermeasures and access to screening, brief intervention, and referral to treatment. Next. For the best buys, they have been proven to be the most cost-effective responses that low and middle-income countries can have, and they work quite well for developed countries for many years. There are hundreds of studies that literally demonstrate that. Next. And the situation in the Caribbean is quite depressing, I would say. There is a lot to be done. There is almost very few countries that have a national alcohol policy in place. Next. Taxation may exist, but it's not adjusted for inflation, or was done many years ago. The buying power of the people increased, so alcohol becomes cheaper. Next. There is a licensing system that can in most countries, and that can be used as a tool for policy making, because you can attach license revocation or suspension and restrictions based on the behavior of bars and restaurants, and it is a privilege that should cost significantly and can help in reducing the easy availability of alcohol. Next. Restrictions on hours, locations, and days are in some countries, and they're not very well implemented or enforced by the rule of law. There is, despite the written policy. Next. Minimum drinking age, also there is a lot to improve. 16 is a very low, at least 18, and we would recommend actually 21 because there is evidence for that. And the more you delay the initiation of drinking or by law to regulate drinking, the better in terms of public health effects. Next. The advertising, there are several questions that are asked in the WHO survey on alcohol, and countries reply to it, and you can see almost no country has restrictions on national TV. Next. On the alcohol industry sponsorship of youth events, no restrictions. The awareness-raising activities are done or often without industry support, at least that's what is reported, but not in all countries. Next. And in terms of drink driving countermeasures, we have a lot to improve. The recommendation of WHO is to lower the limit to 0.05 or below, and 0.02 for youth, and to have sobriety checkpoints or random breath testing, and that is also not regularly done. Next. So to finalize, I just wanted to raise the other part of this equation, which is the role of the alcohol industry. Next. Alcohol is a commodity, but it has no health benefits, and it costs more to governments than the profits that it makes. But they are an important commodity, is embedded culturally, politically, economically, and as a result, they are powerful players that influence policy decisions and shape the social norms in any country. The production and sale of alcohol generates profits for many sectors of society: farmers, manufacturers, advertisers, investors, bar owners, restaurants, etc., hotels. The employment also is generated with that, but that can be used for selling and doing other stuff as well, and then tax revenues for the government. But where analyses were done on the cost of alcohol to society demonstrate systematically that the costs are higher than the profits. So it's not an ordinary commodity for sure. It needs to be regulated. Next. And the alcohol industry says they want to be part of the solution, but for that they will need to reduce about half of their profits, which is very unlikely. This is an analysis done in the US, then repeated in a more recent study, and it shows that the sales of alcohol to underage drinkers and to those who drink too much excessively make up almost 50% of the profits. So the industry wouldn't survive on moderate drinking, so to say. Next. So there are several regulatory challenges and that include how the government can regulate and assign the authority to implement the policies and have clarity of functions and do a transparent process to develop policies without the influence of the alcohol industry. And here, just to leave for you, there are several documents that we have for policy action. There is a new report that will come up very soon. And we also have virtual courses that are available free of charge and in several languages. We're finalizing one on alcohol and pregnancy in Spanish and English. And thank you very much for listening.
Krystal Boyea has worked in the region for many years as a youth advocate covering the spectrum of NCDs. She's a brilliant speaker. She's a young person. We were really pleased to have her come on board to lead on this effort for Caribbean Alcohol Reduction Day this year. Given the theme was youth, let's talk about alcohol. So I'm going to go ahead and give Krystal the floor right now. Thank you.
Thank you, Maisha. I hope everybody can hear me. So as Maisha just said, my name is Krystal Boyea. I'm speaking to you from Barbados. I have been an advocate for non-communicable diseases and health for many years, and I'm here to talk to you today about the perspectives of young people in the Caribbean towards alcohol. Next slide. So as I go through this presentation, I will answer a few questions. Why do we, young people, consume alcohol? And what ways do we think alcohol consumption can be reduced amongst our age group, our peers, our fellow young people? Next slide, please. Okay, so with youth being the focus and the ultimate theme for Caribbean Alcohol Reduction Day 2018, we decided that we didn't just want to share the facts and stats about young people and alcohol. We wanted to include young people and talk to young people around the Caribbean and find out what they thought about alcohol. We wanted to create a conversation. Let's talk about alcohol. So with our volunteers from around the region, we interviewed several young people of drinking ages, 18 to 30, from Barbados, Trinidad, Jamaica, and St. Kitts and Nevis, and asked them a series of qualitative questions about alcohol. These questions aim to gather their perspectives on why young people consume alcohol and what strategies can be adopted to reduce the levels of alcohol consumption. So what I'm going to do now is share with you some of the responses to some of the questions we asked. Next slide. What comes to mind when I say alcohol? So this is one of the questions that we asked. Some of the responses were the very distinct smell, drinking, drunken nights, bad experiences and decisions, being intoxicated, carnival. The different types of alcohol were also mentioned: wine, beer, rum, etc., bars, and not having control of your behavior. Next slide, please. Why do you think we as young people drink? Some of the responses again were to be cool, because everyone is drinking. To relieve stress, quite a few people mentioned this, from school or at home, to take away their problems at home. For recreation, for fun, to be social. I don't know, good question. Because it's part of our culture and way of life. We interviewed about 11 people, and that came up more than half of the amount of times. Next slide, please. Do you think it is important for young people to be careful with the amount of alcohol they consume, and why? Majority of the people said yes, we need to be very careful. Absolutely. It's technically poison and can kill you if you're not careful. It's not necessarily bad, but too much can be. 2 people said no. If you drink a little, it's fine. And lastly, it can impair your judgment and harm your health. You will notice here that nobody actually mentioned drinking and driving. A couple people were aware of the harms of alcohol, but nobody actually mentioned drinking and driving. Next slide, please. How can we reduce the levels of alcohol consumption amongst young people? So amongst the 11 young people from around the Caribbean, we asked this question, and here are some of the answers. We can be more strict about our purchasing laws and check ID at point of purchase. You can't. You would have to change our culture to reduce the levels of alcohol consumption. You can increase the prices, raise the drinking age, and then some of them, right after they said that, said, but we'll still drink anyway because we can get it at home. You can talk about the negative effects more. Not possible. And make strict consequences about underage drinking. Quite a few people mentioned that, you know, there's a lot of young people who drink in the countries that do have a drinking age, a strict drinking age, but there's no consequences if they're caught, or strict consequences drinking underage. Next slide, please. So what I'm going to share with you, as I'm just on the cusp of youth, is my perspective in having these conversations with all these young people. Alcohol is part of our culture. It is ingrained in our Caribbean society. It is introduced into our everyday lives from birth. You know, several people use it for remedies, for teething. It's introduced into our cooking. It is cheap and easy to access. This was one of the questions that we asked, and everybody said yes, that it was very cheap and easy to access. A lot of the parties that we go to, you pay a price to enter, and then you don't pay anything to drink. There's a lot of happy hours or 2-for-1s that young people will just wait until that one happy hour, consume as much as they can, and then not drink for the rest of the night. It is everywhere. It is in our songs, on our buildings, in our magazines, on billboards, and at school fairs and sporting events. I can't think of one popular road march song that doesn't mention alcohol in it somewhere. It is associated with having fun and having a good time. Whenever you think about having fun as a young person, you think about drinking. Next slide, please. ways to reduce alcohol consumption. So in my view, we definitely need to increase the conversation, and I commend everyone who is associated with Caribbean Alcohol Reduction Day, because we do need to increase this conversation about alcohol and the harmful effects. There's a lot being discussed about obesity, and we would have talked a lot in the past about smoking, but we do need to increase throughout the year that talk about alcohol, and not just today. And to get popular young persons in society to share the alcohol reduction message and join the campaign. This is very hard. I'm going to talk about barriers in my next slide, because several of them are sponsored by different brands of alcohol, but we do need to get popular people that young people think are cool to get onto this message. And we need to restrict alcohol sales. I went to school in Toronto, and I very distinctly remember the difference between how I could access alcohol in the Caribbean versus in Canada. There were very strict hours, places, and locations that you could get. Can everybody still hear me? It says I'm muted. That you could get alcohol. And in the Caribbean, you can access it any day, anytime, anywhere, essentially. There's a rum shop on every corner. Next slide, please. And the barriers to change. Young people see the ability to drink alcohol as a privilege. You know, it's that one thing that is technically restricted from you until you're a certain age. And once you are of that age, it is seen as a privilege to drink. When we went around to do these interviews, our goal initially was to actually film these young people and share the interviews on social media. Caribbean people are colorful, energetic, and always have the best responses to questions, and we wanted to use that energy and gain momentum on social media. And one thing that we quickly found was that only 1 out of the 11 people wanted to have their interview filmed. They didn't want to talk about alcohol on social media, on camera, on film, because it's not cool not to drink or to think that people should drink less. The business of alcohol, as we all know, alcohol is a multi-million-dollar business. Even all of our shows, carnivals, and celebrities are sponsored by alcohol, and if we are to put laws in place, that's going to be one of the barriers that we have to overcome. It is very much celebrated and infused in our culture, and young people feel invincible and don't think that the negative effects will happen to them personally. This is a human flaw. You don't tend to think that any of these things will happen to you until they do happen to you or a loved one. And that is one of the things we do need to overcome as young people. So I commend everybody for being involved in this movement. And I think as we go into the festive season, the Christmas season, into the new year, and into all the carnivals throughout the year, we need to keep this talk about alcohol reduction at the forefront of our conversation. And next slide. Thank you.
Thank you, Krystal. That was an excellent presentation. Thank you for bringing us the youth perspective on this really important issue. So we're having some challenges with Dr. Maharaj's presentation. So while we wait to see if we can get that sorted out, let's see if we have any questions from anyone who's listening. And I'll check the chat box. And while I check the chat box, I'm going to ask Krystal to talk a bit about the different infographics that we developed for CARD 2018, because I think it's really interesting the different types of audiences that we developed materials for this year.
Yes, okay, sure, no problem. So we developed 4 infographics this year for Caribbean Alcohol Reduction Day. The first one is called Know the Facts. It's aimed towards policymakers, anybody out there who wants to know the stats and facts about alcohol and young people. The second one we did is called Your Kids and Alcohol. It's aimed towards parents and guardians and framing that conversation as to how they can talk to their kids about alcohol. We actually have a very great infographic video on this as well, and all of these you can actually find on the Healthy Caribbean Coalition website and on our social media. In this infographic, there are also tips and tools for young people to be able to talk to their parents and guardians about the pressures to take part in alcohol at a young age. So that's called SHARE, and we have some pointers on that, how you can talk to your parents about alcohol. The third one is called Youth and Alcohol Don't Mix. That is aimed at young people of drinking age. Again, there's some stats and figures in that. And the last one is called Alcohol Myths and Misconceptions. Many young people think that, you know, again, we're invincible. We have all these myths about alcohol, and that one is targeting that. You know, it's okay if I drive. It's not going to kill me. So that one puts a lot of stats at the forefront, and it's also in an infographic video. It's been getting a really good response, that video, because it's a very smart way to show how alcohol does impact young people. So I'd recommend that you all share those and view those, and if you don't have them, please email us so that we can send them to you.
We do have a question actually to Dr. Monteiro. Do we have enough evidence to justify treating alcohol as we do the use of tobacco? So I'll go ahead and let Dr. Monteiro respond to that.
Okay. Yes, thank you. Alcohol is not exactly like tobacco because it is a much older culture and it's ingrained in a large amount of societies, even though more than half of the world's population does not drink. I don't think currently we could propose a world with no alcohol. But apart from that, a framework convention on alcohol control with that it would include the best buys, the treatment, illicit trade, illicit production, etc., does look very similar to tobacco and could be a way to get agreement at a global level, particularly when it comes to marketing controls. Alcohol is a globalized industry, and despite attempts to control marketing within a country, there is a lot through social media and the internet that is not controlled currently.
Okay, so hello everybody. Thank you very much for joining us this afternoon to celebrate our third Caribbean and Alcohol Reduction Day. And I want to thank the Healthy Caribbean Coalition and PAHO for the wonderful support that they've given this idea. And we expect to see this grow and grow. I'm here today to just very quickly talk to you a little bit on some of the ideas around youth and alcohol advertising. We were able to hear from Dr. Monteiro about the impact on alcohol in our Caribbean populations and in the Americas. And I think it's good for us to always remember within the context of things like the WHO best buys and the good buys, what actually is the evidence for this. And I want to share a couple of the things that I've come across and some of the research. Next slide, please. So I'm going to just start with a little bit on the 2015 Global Alcohol Policy Conference Declaration. This was a declaration that came out of the conference from GAPC from Edinburgh. I'll talk a little bit about something that's already a convention, an international convention that many of our countries of the Americas have signed on to, which is the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child. I'll just reiterate again what Dr. Monteiro said about the WHO global strategy, specifically around best buys and good buys. I'll give you a little bit on the research around alcohol advertising and youth, and then finally share an international success story with you all. Next slide. So the Global Alcohol Policy Conference 2015 declared We recognize the right of children to grow up safe from alcohol-related harm and call upon national governments to implement their commitments in the United Nations Convention on the Rights of the Child and other human rights agreements to ensure that children are protected from alcohol-related harm and that alcohol control policies and legislation reflect those commitments. So, as Dr. Monteiro was saying, is that we need some of the policy decisions around alcohol in order to protect our populations. Next slide. The UN Convention on the Rights of the Child, in its Article 17, talks about the mass media and is aimed at the promotion of the social, spiritual, and moral well-being and physical and mental health of the child. Article 33 states that parties shall take all appropriate measures, including legislative, administrative, social, and educational measures to protect children from the illicit use of narcotic drugs and psychotropic substances as defined in the relevant international treaties. So the point that the conference was making is that many of the treaties that countries have already signed on, that they're inherent in these are the ideas that we need to protect children from harmful substances, and they count alcohol as being one of these. So if we had to have from a philosophical and from an ethical issue, we can say that we already have the rules and regulations in international policy and law that we should be using to attack and to control alcohol issues. Next slide. So just remind you the WHO Global Strategy on Alcohol. Next slide. Talks about best buys. And best buy is an intervention that is not only highly cost effective, but also cheap, feasible, and often culturally acceptable to implement. And these best buys reduce risk and prevent disease and population-wide interventions. Next. And you see here that the interventions here for the risk factor, and this slide was also shown by Maristela because it's an important slide in alcohol policy understanding, that the harmful use of alcohol causing greater than 50 million disability-adjusted life years and about 4.5% of the global burden. Just by the interventions can be to restrict the access to retail alcohol, enforce the bans on alcohol advertising, and raise the taxes. And these are what we call the best buys, and then the so-called good buys, drunk driving and hazardous drinking, which forms the basis for the safer advertisements that we see that being promoted from this year. Next slide. So that's just to highlight the interventions again. Next one. And so just to show you a little more closely what these are. So retail access to restrict access to retail alcohol, enforce the bans on alcohol advertising, raise taxes on alcohol, enforce drunk driving, and brief advice for hazardous drinking. Next slide. So we want to focus on this one on alcohol advertising and youth, and to look at what is really the evidence for that advertising and youth. There's a link, and there have been 3 systematic reviews that have looked at this. Next slide. The first one is from 2009. This is by Anderson et al. And the title says, The Impact of Alcohol Advertising and Media, Exposure on Adolescent Alcohol Use. And there were 13 longitudinal studies following up more than 38,000 participants. And they concluded that longitudinal studies consistently suggest that exposure to the media and commercial communications on alcohol is associated with the likelihood that adolescents will start to drink and with increased drinking among baseline drinkers. Next slide. The second study, also published in 2009, talks about the effect of alcohol advertising, marketing, and portrayal on drinking behaviors in young people. And this also had 7 cohorts studied following up more than 13,000 young people. They concluded that data from prospective studies suggests that there is an association between exposure to alcohol advertising or promotional activities and subsequent alcohol consumption in young people. Inferences about the modest effect sizes found are limited by the potential influence of residual or unmeasured confounding. So they're again suggesting that there is a link, even though that confounding can sometimes interfere with what the final results were. Next slide. Now, both of these studies, next slide, please. Both of these studies were from 2009, but they actually looked at different studies altogether. So the first paper covered studies from 1994 to 2000, and the study from Smith looked at those same studies plus an additional 9. So there was some overlap, but the second paper looked at a slightly larger population of studies, just to show that there wasn't there was some reproducibility in the interpretation of the results. Next slide. And then the third study, this was published last year by Dr. David Jernigan, and he looked at 7 longitudinal studies, 3 randomized control studies, and 23 cross-sectional studies. Next slide. And this, again, consistently shows, if you look at this graph here, this is called a forest plot. 1 on the odds ratio means that there's no difference between exposure and non-exposure. But you see all of the final results shown as the dots are to the right of the 1, showing that the odds ratio are increased, saying that there is some increase in the ability of people to use alcohol, in the initiation of alcohol, increasing alcohol consumption, binge drinking, or hazardous drinking initiation. And so that these are all saying basically the same thing, that advertisements and exposure to advertisements were encouraging young people to use alcohol. Now, if you remember back to Maristela's slides, there is no control, or very little control of alcohol advertisements within the region. So this is an area for a lot of our social media interactions, for our civil society to be involved with trying to change this kind of approach within the region and looking at creating a national and regional policy around alcohol advertisements. Next slide. So the one study that we've done in Trinidad, looking at the perception of roles of advertisement in influencing the purchasing and consumption of alcohol in Trinidad. This was a qualitative study of young people. It concluded that participants' perception was alcohol advertisements had a mixed impact on theirs and other purchasing. And it appears contradictory because there's so much advertising going on. It means that people may not even be aware of how alcohol advertisements is impacting on both their consumption patterns and their decision making around alcohol use. So we need to have a lot more education and knowledge around people's exposure, and I think there's a lot of work to be done. Next slide. So I want to just conclude here with something I've been following recently, which is looking at an international success story. I think there's some lessons for us to learn here, and I like to share this story with almost anyone who would listen. Next slide. So this story is about this country, where you can see the Northern Lights and a little bit of Hobbit Town there on the left. And this is actually Iceland. Next slide. So Iceland became the smallest nation to ever qualify for the FIFA World Cup. The average player age is 28.6 years. And I've always been a little concerned because they dethroned Trinidad and Tobago, my country, as the smallest ever nation to qualify for a World Cup. And so this was one record that Trinidad and Tobago had, and they've taken us over. Now, there are 300,000 people in Iceland. The population of Trinidad is 1.3 million. So they were able to get a football team out of roughly 13,000 young men. That's the number of young men within the age of 20 to 34. So it's a very high success rate in terms of getting young people who will be fit and being able to participate. Next slide. And associated with this success has been an incredible decline in substance use in the Icelandic young people. And you see here the intoxication in the last 30 days in 1997, 1998 was 42%. They were able to bring this down to 2013 to less than 5%. And this is also applied to cigarette use and marijuana use. Next slide. And compared to the rest of Europe and other European countries, Iceland has been having this dramatic success, showing their alcohol use in the past 30 days. How were they able to do this? Next slide. So they started a legal framework around 1995 in which it became illegal to buy tobacco under the age of 18 and alcohol under the age of 20. Tobacco and alcohol advertising was banned completely in Iceland. They also started to pay parents to get their kids to stay in school. It was mandatory that schools would have after-hour activities for the children, and a law was passed prohibiting children between the ages of 13 and 16 from being outside after 10 in winter and midnight in summer. And these laws are still in effect today. Next slide. The other had other elements. There were something called Project Self-Discovery. There was the work of the US psychologist named Harvey Milkman, and there was this financial commitment by the government for the families. So it was other things, and you can read on this on the internet, or you can send me an email and I'll try to send you some information on it. So they were able to show that success, and I think partly due to things like banning alcohol advertisements and having a greater level of commitment by families to their children and to a reduction in alcohol and other drug use. Next slide. So in summary, just quickly here now, more than 20 longitudinal studies conducted between 1994 and 2015 in more than 18 research sites and summarized in 3 systematic reviews are arriving at the same conclusion, that there are significant associations between exposure to, awareness of, and engagement with or receptivity to alcohol marketing at baseline, and subsequent initiation of alcohol use, initiation of binge drinking, drinking in the past 30 days, and alcohol problems at follow-up. Next slide. When alcohol advertising restrictions are employed with other youth-friendly activities, there's a potential for substantial reduction in youth alcohol consumptions, as in the case of the study of Iceland. So this was just a quick little presentation, and I wanted to just keep you all aware that there is a link, and then that link shows that in many longitudinal studies that there's a link between exposure to advertisements and other marketing ploys and youth drinking. And in this one case, where we've seen a reduction in advertising and so on, can show certain types of success in our young people. So if we really want to improve enhance our young people and the success within the region, we need to think seriously about some of these restrictions. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Rohan. Excellent. I was happy to get you on board and get you presenting, even if later than we'd anticipated. So we're going to wrap up. I've got 2 questions. One person asked how we can access the materials. I believe that was where the question was going. And you can access them on the Healthy Caribbean website. So just Google Healthy Caribbean Coalition. And the other question was for Krystal, and it was really around what are the key next steps to be taken to reduce youth alcohol consumption in the Caribbean. So I'm going to hand over to Krystal to respond to that very quickly before we wrap up with Sir Trevor.
Okay, well, great question. I really think the first step should be continuing the conversation in a more formal way. Right now, we don't really talk too much about alcohol, and as youth, we tend not to listen when it comes up. We need to get more, as I say, famous people, more role models within our society to talk about it, to form a coalition. There's some great work coming out of the Healthy Caribbean right now with their childhood obesity campaign that has really hit the ground running, and young people are listening. So I feel like we could use those examples and campaigns around unhealthy levels of drinking, and not just advertise Caribbean Alcohol Reduction Day in November, but to take it throughout the year. Just like how Coca-Cola changes their ads every season, we should be changing our ads for every carnival, every season, to remind people to don't drink and drive or reduce their levels of alcohol, but just really to continue the talk.
Great, thank you. So I'm going to pass over to Sir Trevor now to close off the meeting.
So thanks very much, Maisha. And let me first of all begin by thanking our presenters, Dr. Maristela Monteiro, who's Senior Advisor Alcohol and Substance Abuse at PAHO, Krystal Boyea, our Youth Advocate for NCD Prevention and Control, and Dr. Rohan Maharaj, who is the Alcohol Policy Advisor for the HCC. Thanks very much to the presenters, and thanks very much to those of you who've attended to and listened in on the webinar. Apologies for the slight technical issues, but these always seem to be a bit of a challenge. Having said that, by way of a few closing comments, I'd like to start where Krystal finished, which is carrying on the conversation. This webinar, as you've heard, is the HCC's contribution to sensitizing the Caribbean to the challenges, to the dangers, in fact, of alcohol use. On this occasion, we have highlighted the issue as it relates to the youth. But this area is a very challenging area for us in the Caribbean, as has been so well articulated by the presenters. But it is nevertheless one that we think it's very important that we should highlight. And so as we support the views that may be summarized by saying that essentially what we've heard is that we need to address the issue of alcohol abuse by, if you will, in the first instance, a two-pronged approach. An approach that speaks to legislation and policy, and secondly, public education and information coupled with advocacy. And somewhere within that mix, we need to also encourage the private sector to be more responsible in the ways that we have indicated. And so it's really just left for me once again to thank everyone. We in the HCC will continue to seek to contribute in this, quite frankly, much neglected area, this area of harmful effects of alcohol on our people. We will continue to seek to contribute, hoping eventually to get much greater attention and action on the issue. And so once again, thanks very much. Thanks also in particular to PAHO's technical team and PAHO for having provided the technical assistance for the webinar. And so again, I thank you, the attendees, as well for having taken part in the webinar. And as we say, stay tuned for our follow-up initiatives and activities. Thank you very much, and goodbye, everyone, and all the very best for the Christmas season and the New Year. Goodbye.